Hello, welcome to another episode of Out of the FHIR podcast, where we talk about fun topics such as FHIR, interoperability, data, and anything else that comes to mind. Today, we have the privilege of having Jason from Fasten Health and Brendan Keeler, who needs no introduction. So you want to go first?
Sure, yeah. Jason, I'm the founder of Fasten Health. So Fasten is an interoperability platform that makes it easy for patients to share their medical records with organizations that they trust. So clinical trials, personal health record apps, AI startups, these organizations that don't have a treatment purpose use, but still need access to patient medical records. We directly integrate with about 45,000 healthcare systems across the US, integrate with approximately 43 or so different EHR vendors. And we provide a single unified API for organizations to integrate with.
Cool. Thank you. Brendan?
Hey, I'm Brendan Keeler. I lead the interoperability practice at HTD Health. Previously, I've held positions at Epic, both domestically and abroad, at Redox, helping apps get connected to EHRs, Zeus Health, doing some of the health information exchange networks. I was head of product at FlexPA, which was similarly focused on patient access, albeit for payer data, claims data. So nice yin to the yang of Jason over there, which is how we became friends. And then joined HTD last year. We're a digital consultancy and development agency focused on healthcare. We help people with all sorts of problems in regards to EHR integration, interoperability, specifically within my practice, but more broadly focus on strategy in these dynamic times of changing policy, regulation, and beyond.
Awesome. So let's get started. Do you guys want to give your spiciest take?
Well, my spicy take is that Plaid is an aggregator of financial data from banks. It historically utilized screen scraping, and so use the credentials of different patient or consumers to scrape bank portals and pull the account number and financial details for use in fintech applications. And so by virtue of doing that, it put pressure on banks to release APIs, as well as the regulatory patterns of Dodd-Frank, which occurred in 2010 under the Obama administration, and Rule 1033, which is, was this idea of granting consumers access to their data, pushed things towards an API-centric exchange pattern. But actually this week, even, we've seen that sort of a retrenchment of that in terms of the Republican administration pulling the proposed rule relating to that, these open banking APIs, and major banks start to charge consumers and consumer aggregators like Plaid fees that are 10 times the revenue of these applications. So banking and open banking and Plaid itself are under threat, whereas maybe I'll let Jason talk a bit about what we have in healthcare, but we have strong regulatory backing and still so much to do to make it better. But in a lot of ways, we're well ahead of the banking industry and the fintech industry in terms of open healthcare APIs for patients as consumers.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I agree that on the policy side, we're much further ahead than where Plaid maybe had to start. But then there's this flip side where in the healthcare space, we have to deal with issues that Plaid never really had to think about, right? On the healthcare side, we have 300,000 healthcare organizations, healthcare systems, providers that an application or an organization like Plaid would have to potentially integrate with to provide, significant coverage for actual patients. We have this problem where most individuals remember and know exactly which banking institutions they use. They have username and passwords and account credentials for those institutions. But when it comes to medical records, you can go into a hospital, you can go into a clinic, get treatment, and then leave and never really interact with that health system again. But that treatment, that procedure, that immunization that you had done there is potentially important and should be recorded in your medical history, especially when you're trying to share a longitudinal medical record with some other third party. And if you don't have those credentials, if you never registered for an account, you're not going to be able to show that data to this third party app developer, right? So there's different kinds of problems that kind of come up with the healthcare space and the kind of scale that they have there, as opposed to, in the financial services space where there's maybe a couple hundred to 1,000 or so different financial institutions that individuals actually want to pull their data from.
And it's probably a lot of easier payload for the data to aggregate, right? Like when you're talking about financial data, it's your accounts. It's not, what is USCDI, like 20 plus different FHIR resources that could have many different profiles of each resource inside of it, where you end up like on an aggregate level, you're talking about like 50, 60 different types of data that you can even receive, let alone like how that data lives in one organization versus the next, right? So I think the level of complexity there is that, and I would agree that we are farther along in healthcare in trying to get to that interoperability. So with everything that Fasten has done and currently has, do you feel like what is the one thing that's missing that we don't have a regulatory mandate for? I've heard about people just the level of data that's shared is not comprehensive enough. So like your CDI is a good collection of data, but it doesn't encompass the whole patient record, right? There's a lot of data that's in Epic still that is not there, that's not shared. What are your thoughts about that? And then Brendan, I'll get your take on that as well.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the interesting thing about US core is that's a living standard. So, there's US CDI V1, V2, V3, V4, and they're constantly adding, more resource types, more specific data that is relevant, that is clinically relevant to the patient that they should be able to get. And so I'm really optimistic about that. But at the same time, just looking at it from the scope of patient access APIs, there's this fractured problem around, patients being able to, when you talk about certain demographics, it's very difficult for them to actually remember all the institutions they've been to. It's very difficult for them to be able to search for their healthcare institution by name when they may know it by an acronym, or they may know it by a name that was, a health system that was acquired, a decade later. And so what I think we're missing, especially in the patient access API world, is something akin to a record locator service that we have in the TEFCA world, right? There's not this concept, we've been talking about at the policy level, there's a lot of discussions around a national provider registry. I would love to see an equivalent to that in a patient registry or some sort of national record locator service where an individual could verify their identity and get a list of all the institutions that they've been to and maybe their more current name or full facility name, so that app developers like Fasten, but like Flexpa could actually pull and display that information to patients and let them choose what they want to connect and not want to connect. Putting all this pressure and onus on the individual to remember every single institution they've been to over the decades, it's really, really difficult. And especially as you get into certain demographics, it's almost impossible.
Brendan, you want to give us your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to, so banking doesn't have a record locator service, but doesn't need it, right? Like for the reasons Jason said, you can remember your banks, or once you've left the bank, you don't really need to go back and like, what were my transactions there necessarily? Maybe for like underwriting or something. Maybe there's a use case, but like by and large, not the technology, but the market fragmentation, the structure of that market, as well as the underlying use cases of the consumers of the data dictated different needs. And so we go beyond banking and fintech and we say, wait a minute, to serve this need, we need a help, we need a service, we need some way to find where patients have been. And you see TEFCA as one potential architecture that helps accomplish that, albeit not with a centralized record locator service. I don't think that's feasible in the US, given the idea of a giant, the Commonwealth structure is built that way, as all members of that push up their patients where they've been seen, and then it doesn't store clinical data, but just acts as a record locator service. That architecture isn't preferent in the US because of our individualism and our, fear of this, centralized government having a list of every patient has been seen. Various social mores and things like that prevent us from that particular architecture, which is highly effective in countries like Finland or ones that have less pushback there. So we have a decentralized record locator service proposed via TEFCA that could accomplish this one major gap in individual access today that would make it much more effective. And you might need to have 30 sets of credentials versus I just have one or two in banking. And so that piece is another challenge that the aggregation approach that Fasten is leading in is handicapped by, when only 30% of your patients have the username and credential to log in.
And UPMC alone has 5 different portals. So it is absolutely the case that portalitis is the name of the game. But I do think that there's also portalitis in fintech. Like, I think that one cool thing that I'm able to do in like a credit card or a bank account is that they've implemented interoperability in their own portals. So for example, if I'm an American Express user or a Chase, I can actually go and add my other accounts. So American Express, I think, has this spend right feature that you can connect all of your Chase and Citi and PNC, whatever other bank you have accounts, and they give you a weekly readout of your finances, right? You can also do that on any other portal. So it is kind of like you being able to go into Epic and then add your other system accounts through there and have one picture of your health from any aggregator, right? I think, where do you feel that's...
So that is one, a couple of different mechanisms that is using aggregators like Plaid or Akoya on the back end. So it is using Fasten. So if Epic does have a feature like that where you can link other accounts, but that is not some advanced feature. That is still the same aggregator capability, just embedded into the portal. And so they are, again, not leading in that regard. They are just reusing that same capability. Yeah, we can over-index towards sort of like anecdotes, anecdotal experiences. Regardless, there are way more healthcare organizations than there are banks. Full stop. And so that there's more fragmentation. And so solving portalitis, solving the credential problem is an acute focus for Jason, for most people in the industry. And certainly in the recent CMS R5 session, many people brought this up as a big blocker to a friction point that has prevented consumer apps from hitting their potential. So we have this thesis that we could solve a lot of problems in healthcare if we create a less frictionful ability for patients to access and control their information. That thesis has yet to be tested. And one piece of that, in addition to record location, is getting rid of or having an alternative to username and password, namely IAL, identity proofing.
Jason, what do you think in terms of one of the things that Plaid did well? I think if we go towards the next kind of discussion point is trust building through dev first design, as well as business model clarity, and then data normalization as a product. So they basically said, we're going to focus on the developer experience. Is that the same as what Fasten's focus is, you would say? And then how easy it is for me as a developer, just like jump in and have things running connected to all the Epic sites?
Yeah, I mean, I think a product like Fasten lives or dies by its developer experience, because you're always coming up against this build versus buy decision when it comes to integrating with a new vendor like Fasten, where you're basically saying, hey, our engineering team, it could do the work of integrating with each of these health systems and their EHRs independently, or we could use an aggregator like Fasten. Fasten has to be simpler. We have to be more stable. We have to provide those kind of guarantees to make that equation makes sense. Otherwise, an organization will always go down the route of building themselves. When it comes to healthcare, when it comes to the 300 plus different certified EHR vendors that organizations may theoretically want to integrate with, most organizations will look at that and go, all right, well, actually, there's only maybe a couple of dozen that they would really fundamentally need to integrate with if they want to have broad coverage of the US, just because the healthcare system is so highly concentrated when it comes to which EHR vendors are found in the wild. But yeah, Fasten 100% is based around, all right, well, we recognize that it is difficult still, even with all the standardization, all the policy that we're talking about, there's still significant differences between each EHR. There's still significant differences when it comes to the data and the quality of the data that you're going to get from these various EHRs. So we spend an inordinate amount of time trying to polish off those rough edges when it comes to registering with EHR vendors, providing a single unified API that's seamless and easy to integrate with for developers. And then we go further and provide user-facing, let's say, widgets and functionality so that patients can actually find their various healthcare institutions, right? We didn't really talk about this, but given the fact that there's 300,000 plus healthcare systems and organizations in the US, there's all this branding and metadata and aliases and all those kind of information that patients expect to be able to search on. And that information is not necessarily freely available in public. And so what Fasten and other organizations like us have to do is we have to build our own catalogs. We have to build our own kind of snapshot of what the ecosystem actually looks like. And so when it comes to what value does Fasten add? Yes, part of it is always going to be, we provide a simple API, you integrate with once, you don't have to, build a separate integration with every single EHR, but it's also, that patient experience, right? How do you make it really simple and straightforward for patients to find the institutions that they want to connect? And how do you do that in a way that is seamless when it comes to, the various types of applications that might want to embed Fasten, right? A clinical trial versus a personal health record app versus an AI startup. we have to do it in a way that it's clear that it's a different widget, it's a different organization that's doing this, but at the same time, it needs to feel somewhat seamless and not jarring to individuals that are using those apps.
Yeah, and one thing I'll mention, just two things actually. One is, like, Fasten is the registered application for these APIs. It needs to be seen as such. Like, that is an important distinction in sort of like the handoffs of the HIPAA handoffs that are baked in with consent through this flow. And this is a tension that we see with Flex, but with Fasten, with any of the aggregators, where it's like, oh, you kind of want to streamline it down, but at a certain point, you've streamlined it down such that the app that is accessing isn't being handed off from source system to Fasten to app, but kind of just straight to the other app. And then you're sort of, risk of breaking contractual language. And that tension is present across any time, like any part of the industry, because we had it at Flexible too. And so that's one piece. The second piece is, and this is super important for Jason, it's not just the developer experience. You can have a sick API, but if you do not have conversion that works 90% of the time, where the patient converts, gets through successfully, then your value proposition is only whatever your conversion is. And so if you go and say, hey, I can get you clinical data, you can only get 10% of the time, you have 10% of the value proposition that you're hypothetically marketing. And so that's why it's so important to have great patient experience, findability, invest into like, how do we guide and get people through what either the patient access flow or in the future TEFCA with maximum success rate, because that is just as important as having the GraphQL API or the superlative developer experience. The value add is really important, but more important is, what is your coverage in terms of the number of institutions you can connect to out of the total? And what is your conversion rate? What is the percentage that I actually get data for? And so I think that's why Jason's so locked in on patient experience, because it's not just a nice to have or like an ethical thing or something. It's core to the value proposition here for Plaid, for Fasten, for any aggregator.
Yeah. Great takes, guys. I think I agree with all of that you said. I think that one of the key benefits of having Fasten do a lot of this work is that every organization doesn't have to go through. Having lived it through being a BOL for 3 years, I can definitely tell you that it's just not feasible for every company and every application out there and every solution to develop its own interoperability, essentially, network to connect to every single Epic API and do it well. To your point, Brendan, like to do it well so it actually works 99% of the time. And I think that that's why we do need this kind of like a Plaid experience where it's there, it's a working product. What do you guys think about normalization? I don't want to dive too much because that's its own can of worms, right? Data usability, whatever. And I think we have to start somewhere, which is just get me the damn data, just get me the damn records first. And then we'll worry about if it's actual garbage or something I can use. But what do you guys think about the potential for one of the things that Plaid does is they do offer those analytics services. So enhanced, they go through your financial data and they offer you a product back. If you're a bank or if you're an investment bank or whatever, you can get curated data. So what are you guys' thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in here. I feel like at the end of the day, a lot of the customers that Fasten serves aren't health tech native organizations. They're not organizations that fundamentally understand FHIR resources and all the complexities and intricacies of the patient provider experience. They are usually trying to either provide an incredibly valuable service to the patient, or they're helping a patient maybe share their medical records for some other valuable use, like clinical trials. And in a lot of those cases, the medical data itself isn't the goal, it's the meaning within the medical data, what's encoded in there, right? So you can imagine for a clinical trial, what they're really trying to figure out is, does this patient qualify as a subject for this clinical trial? Or in a personal health record app, they're trying to get meaning from the various parts and pieces of the patient record so that they can display it and show the patient trends or give them some sort of snapshot of what medications they're actively taking and responsible for. So yeah, I think there is this need to, you call it normalization, but I think a lot of organizations are just straight leveraging like AI and LLMs to do this. I think there is this incredible need to be more than just a pipe, which is what Fasten is right now. But in the long term, we do recognize that there is this, that all of our customers fundamentally they want more than just the data. They want to understand what's in the data, and they want to be able to ask questions of the data. So it is something that we're thinking of, but happy to stop there.
What I'll jump in and say, because done lots of thinking and lots of writing about this, is that one-sided network-based products like Fasten have a moat by virtue of doing work connecting to the nodes. That is hard, but it is a finite mode. Just every mode is finite, but relatively finite and measurable. Like if someone wants to copy, they have open ability to copy. It is not a cornered resource, right? It does not enjoy the luxury of network effects, where a two-sided network has network effects in the sense that it is defensible, more defensible. Again, every mode is has some horizon. If I was to say, I want to go build Fasten, I can go and start registering for all the app. Like I can go and do the work. And so it is very important for Plaid or for Fasten or for Flexpa to think about what are the other value propositions I can continue to add on top of just coverage and data depth. And so things like augmentation, deduplication, normalization are really important, because even with standardization, standards-based APIs that back this, that provide a level of normalization, the human condition is entropy. The human condition is to find variance in the optionality of these standards. Will they fill this field in? Will they use a random code set? Will they make a mistake? I know you spoke with Josh Kelly in depth about this, Gene, but right, like even code systems and coding and value sets rife with mistakes. And so an easy way to provide more value when you presumably have solved or semi-solved coverage and conversion rate with this type of aggregation is to focus on normalization, to focus on data augmentation, those things to allow the jobs to be done. You take the next step and you can charge for that additional value. There's different buyer types, I will say, right? Like there are mature buyer types who are technically advanced. They may say, actually, I just don't want to do this stupid task and job to be done of knocking on the door of every EHR and provider in the country. That doesn't sound fun to me, but I am very good at data, so don't do anything to it. That's a distinctly different buyer type that Jason sometimes probably encounters. But then oftentimes there's the less tech forward, that's just the group that says, I need to underwrite this life insurance, or I need to do a job to be done. And the job to be done is not parsing a FHIR payload or a CDA payload or whatever the format is. And so understand those different buyer types and mapping the pricing for the value add versus just the aggregate value add is an important part of pricing and product release strategy for these types of organizations.
One thing I'd maybe just, again, double click on for what Brendan just said is there's certain types of customers that want that true fidelity. They want the guarantee that the data is coming from the EHR without any changes, that we are just a dumb pipe facilitating the collection of medical records and transferring it to our customers. They don't want any modifications. They don't want any additions or enhancements to the data, because they want to be able to legally, in some cases, say that it's untouched.
Please join us next week for part 2 of our conversation on Plaid in healthcare with Jason and Brendan.